Hi everybody and welcome to another true crime story here on the Days of Horror YouTube channel. And today's story has been recommended to us by a family member of the person involved in today's case. It also brings us back here to the centre of Burnley. And it is a story and a case that is shocking but not too uncommon back in the early parts of the 1900s, and it is a case of what is known as Felo-de-se. Now this, my friends, is the shocking but, like I said, true story of Charles James Laffan. Now today's story is one that we would term a case of Felo-de-se, and it's a term often used and referred to in the latter stages of the 1800s and into the early 1900s. I don't think we really hear too much of it in today's society, but it wasn't too uncommon back, like I said, in those periods. And it was a term used to find a verdict on a person who had viciously attacked another person but then took their own lives. We have covered similar stories to this, and again here in Burnley. But as I said right at the very start, today's story has been recommended to us by a family member, a descendant of Charles James Laffan. Now we have been in touch with that person, that family member, throughout this week, who has clarified one or two points for us, just so we get the names of the people correct. So we wish to thank that subscriber. We're not going to put that person's real name anywhere in this story, just for our own privacy. But we do wish to thank that person, and no doubt she will be watching this video, and we do wish to thank you immensely for giving us this opportunity to talk about your family and the story that took place. Now the story itself begins way back in December of 1910, and Charles James Laffan and his wife Alice, they were having some difficulties. By all accounts, it wasn't a happy marriage, but yet Charles always tried to win the affections of his wife back. Now in 1910 December, Charles had moved in with his parents, and his father was also called Charles James, so we'll call his father Charles James Senior. His mother was called Eliza, and he had moved into their premises at 14 Napier Street, like I said, sometime around 1910 in December. However, Charles would often, and quite regularly, he would make his way to the house where his wife was living with 8 children. It was reported that she was living with 8 of her own children. Now, at least one of these children, a boy, was from a previous marriage to an Arthur Fletcher, and he was known as William. He was 11 years old at the time of this attack and the time this story took place. But all the newspaper articles that we have come across and we've read all seem to say that she had 8 children living with her at the time. Now, the attack itself, like I said, Charles would often make a trip around to Scott's Terrace where Alice was living. Napier Street was literally a 5-minute walk away, so it wasn't that difficult for Charles himself, and it wasn't out of his way to make that short trip. Now, on the afternoon of the attack, Charles had made his way to the home of Alice. It was around 12:15 midday when screams would be heard from a neighbour next door, a neighbour by the name of Mrs. Pickles. Now, she was startled by it, and she could also hear some children crying. So she went into the home. I will presume it was the front door of the home, which It obviously would have been unlocked at the time. And when she made her way into the kitchen, she saw Charles lifting a tin pot off the table and take a mouthful of what the substance was inside. He then ran out of the kitchen into the backyard with Alice following him. Alice collapsed onto the floor, onto the ground in the backyard itself. And Mrs. Pickles herself went to attend to poor Alice. Now, there was blood streaming from the back of Alice's head, and it appears that Charles had at some point picked up a small handheld axe, not one of the larger ones, but one of the small ones, perhaps for just cutting pieces of wood up to throw into the stoves. But he had attacked her several times on the back of the head. She was on the floor bleeding quite heavily at this point, so obviously the screaming and the kids crying, the children crying, alerted more neighbours. Charles fled through the back streets of Scott's Terrace and up along Beresford Street. He would then be seen by another witness called Mary appearing on the corner of Beresford Street, which led onto another street called Fielding Street. Now, we are going to make the walk from Fielding Street to where Charles would ultimately be found by a police constable known as PC Wright, and we're going to do that shortly. Now, as for poor Alice, she was obviously, like I said, she was lying on the ground in the backyard, and Mrs. Pickles tried to attend to her best she could, but obviously the wounds on the back of her head were quite severe. Now, Dr. Pemberton was soon called for, and he quickly arrived at the scene. He would attend to her wounds by placing several stitches into the back of her head. She would then be placed onto a waiting horse ambulance, which would take her to nearby Victoria Hospital. Now, obviously there she'd be seen to more professionally, more better, if you will. She would spend several days inside the hospital just until she could recover from her ordeal. So as we make our way up Fielding Street, this is the area where Charles Laffan would have appeared after attacking his wife Alice. And it was on the corner of Beresford Street and Fielding Street, which is just coming up to our left now, where another witness would see Charles take out a razor from his pocket and then commence to slit his own throat. On the corner of Beresford Street, which led on to Fielding Street, like I said, is just coming up to our left, just past this white van here. And we'll overlay some maps as we go along, some older maps. But just where this fence is here, this wooden fence, and the house on the right, number 15, that is where Beresford Street once would have come out and onto Fielding Street, which is here. Charles then fled up Fielding Street towards Clough Street, where he would then turn right and make his way to a place known as Vicarage Place. Now, as we approach Clough Street, one of the only remaining buildings from 1911 is this former, I think it was a school at the time, and it's just in front of me here. It's now a fitness centre, but where we are now is the corner of Fielding Street and heading on to Clough Street. So Charles would have run up this street here. Now, obviously it's all changed over the years, it wouldn't have looked anything like this, and like I said, the only remaining structure from what I know is this building here. This would have been here back in 1911, and if walls and buildings could speak, it does make you wonder what that building would actually tell us. So we'll make our way up Clough Street and head towards what was known as Vicarage Place. Now, as we leave Clough Street, which is on our left, Charles would have made his way to Burdett Street, or Burdett Street, which is this one, and just past these terraced houses was an area known as Vicarage Place. And from Vicarage Place, he would have then made his way towards Peace Street, and ultimately to where he would die from the extent of his injuries that he obviously self-inflicted. So again, many of these terraced houses, these would have been here in situ, just like the old school still is. So we could argue and say that obviously there's more buildings here. So again, if walls could speak, be interested to know what these premises will make of it. But it was past here onto back Peace Street where Charles would ultimately die from his injuries. Now, it was in Vicarage Place, just here, where PC Wright, who had made his way from Accrington Road, which is just in front of us, he made his way into Vicarage Place, and it was here he found the razor that Charles had used on himself. But he followed a blood trail, he found splatters of blood, and it led him to here, which is still known as Peace Street. But back in 1911, I think it was known as Back Peace Street, and if you just look on there, it actually says Peace Street on the wall side. But we're just going to go over to where Charles's body would be found by PC Wright. And like I said, it was the bloodstains that led him to this location. Now, if we look down onto the floor, we've still got remnants from the past. We have got the actual cobbles, the sets, and again, these little things that are still there from when this horrific crime took place. So we're going to go to where Charles will be found by PC Wright lying on the embankment of a railway, and it was just over this wall. And to our, well, directly in front of us, I was going to say to our left, but directly in front of us and just on the embankment, just down here, this is where Charles will be found lying on his back with, like I said, the self-inflicted wounds, and this is the railway line. But this, most certain, is the location where Charles himself would have been found. Now, when Charles was found, a load more witnesses had appeared, along with PC Wright, and he muttered and he ushered for a piece of paper and a pencil. And on that piece of paper, he would write, albeit in an unsteady hand, he would write that he wanted to be buried in the same grave as his son. Now, his son, who was also called Charles, had passed away at the age of 16 back in, I think it was 1899. And he wanted to be buried alongside his son. Now, they were the last words that Charles would ever, well, you couldn't say he would mutter, but he most certainly wrote those words on that piece of paper. He wished to be buried alongside his son. But it was here where Charles was found after PC Wright had scaled, I think it was a 6 foot or a 7 foot wall to get onto the embankment. So that would have taken some doing by Charles, because obviously he's losing a lot of blood at this point. He would have been in a lot of pain, but he still managed to scamper over the wall and onto the embankment, which, like I said, is just down below. So this is a better angle, and we can see more now of the incline, the embankment itself. And it would have been just over in that direction, somewhere on that embankment, where, like I said, PC Wright found Charles himself lying on that afternoon, just after midday, back on the 13th of February 1911. And this is the area where Charles sadly passed away from the injuries he sustained to himself. So this street, Burnley Street, which leads on to Back Peace Street, this probably has a kind of similar look to what it would have done back in 1911, albeit the satellite dishes on the houses on the cars outside the houses. But otherwise, this pretty much would have looked pretty much as it is now. You've still got the original cobbles, the sets on the floor, and like I said, this is where Charles would have run, or he would have tried to run, one would argue, albeit weakly, along this direction, and he climbed over the wall just where those trees are onto the railway embankment. But Burnley Street, this does, well, it's kind of stayed the same throughout the years, and like I said, apart from the modern features such as the cars, the satellite dishes, the street itself looks pretty much as it may have done all those years ago. Now, when PC Wright was on the embankment attending to Charles, Dr. Pemberton was called for, and he arrived quickly to the home of Alice, where he would attend to her wounds. Now, after stitching her up, she was sent along to Victoria Hospital under horse-drawn ambulance, where the wounds would obviously be seen to a lot more better. You know, she'd be looked after a lot more better, and she would spend several days in hospital until she recovered to some extent. As for Charles, he passed away on that embankment, and his body was be conveyed over to Cog Lane Police Station, which is no longer there, else we would have gone there today. But his body would be conveyed over to Cog Lane Station. Now, an inquest would take place 3 days later, and a verdict would quickly be made, or come to, of Felo-de-se. And basically, they would ask questions to Charles's father if Charles himself was a drunkard, to which his father would deny, saying that he was a well-mannered man, hardly in any trouble. He might have been depressed, he might have been quiet on the day of the attack of his wife, but other than that, he was a good, hard, honest worker. Something happened on that morning, that afternoon I should say, midday, which Charles himself just snapped. Now, we'll never know what occurred, what was said to push Charles over the edge, but something did indeed occur, and he tried to kill his wife. He ultimately succeeded in taking his own life, and this is where the verdict of Felo-de-se came from. Now, Scott's Terrace is no longer here. It was bulldozed many years ago to make way for these new builds here in Burnley. But another feature that still exists to this day is, of course, the old railway itself and the railway bridge. But all access up to the embankment itself has now been blocked off, as you can see just over there. But it was on Scott's Terrace where Alice herself had lived, and it was reported that she lived with 8 children. Now, when we've looked at the census records, we can only find a list of 5 children who were living with her, but that was back in 1901, and the attack took place in 1911. So obviously there's a 10-year gap there, so some of the children may have grown up and fled, but it's weird how the stories in the newspaper say she lived with 8 children, but we can only find 5. But as you can see, this is the old railway line, but there's just no access up to it. Else I'd show you guys where back Scott's Terrace once was. We just can't get up to it anymore. It's just inaccessible, and I understand why, because obviously there's an active railway line above us, and obviously you don't want children playing on that. But this would have been an old pathway, maybe up into it. I don't really know. It looks like there used to be steps which would have led on to this, the embankment itself, this side. So if we were to look at it and we step back in time over 100 years ago, Scott's Terrace would have been just here. So just like you've got these houses here, Scott's Terrace would have been about here, and back Scott's Terrace, like I said, maybe somewhere along the embankment itself. But this is where Charles himself fled, went down back terrace of Scott's Terrace, down the back of it, and he appeared at the junction of Beresford Street and Fielding Street. The funeral of Charles James Laffan took place here in Burnley Cemetery on Saturday the 18th of February. It was a small service, not many people attended, and one would presume because of the kind of death he suffered from and the attack on his wife Alice. I think respect for Charles was few and far between with people of Burnley. It was a shocking tale and people had a morbid curiosity. But from all accounts, the actual service itself, only a handful of people turned up to pay their respects. Now, Charles himself was buried in the same grave as his son, who was also known as Charles James, or called Charles James. So there is 3 Charles James in this story: his father, his son, and obviously himself. Now we know that, like I said, his grave, his headstone number is 3052, and it's somewhere in this vicinity. Now, as many people who watch our videos will testify to, we don't have a very good record here in Burnley Cemetery when it comes to looking for final resting places, simply because even though the bodies are still in the ground, a lot of the headstones have disappeared. So we're going to have a walk around, look for 3052. I'm just hoping that we do find the final resting place of Charles James Laffan. Now, as you can see, we're into early June and the grass is overgrown to some extent, and Vicky's just shouted. So let's see what number she's got. But again, and I just said it further back, but look at all this space here with no headstones. So it's going to be interesting again if we can find anything on the Laffan family. Now, the substance that Charles was seen drinking from the tin pot by Mrs. Pickles, it was a chemical substance known as salts of lemon, and it was primarily used to wash dirty marks, iron mould, out of white clothing and linen, but it was highly poisonous. And just like the term Felo-de-se, poisonings back in the early 1900s was a common occurrence. And salts of lemon, and I think, I could be wrong, but I think the other term for that chemical is oxalic acid. And we covered the tale of oxalic acid death back in Helmshire, and a young servant girl named Sarah who took her own life. She took a mouthful of the same substance before hanging herself. But oxalic acid, or salts of lemon, it was a commonly used chemical, and when mixed with water it could be used to, like I said, clean or try to bring the best out of old, dirty, worn linen and clothing. For people to get their hands on salts of lemon, they simply had to go to the local pharmacy, and they will be given a small packet. And like I said, this packet was a powder substance. It would only need 14 grams to digest, which could cause death in a person, sometimes as little as 14 grams. But it was such an easy to get hold of poison. Obviously, when people bought it, they had to maintain, they had to make sure that it was locked away, especially from young children. And again, just like the story of Sarah in Helmshire, there is another story in Tottington where a young boy died from some poison chemical, a reaction to some poison chemical, a substance that he had taken, and the same chemical was found in his parents' kitchen, and his parents would deny all knowledge of that. Now, that is a story we are going to be covering shortly, because there's a lot more to it than just a simple case of poisoning, but we will get into that story at a later date. But for certain, oxalic acid, or the salts of lemon, it was a commonly used cleaning product back, like I said, in the latter stages of the 1800s and the early parts of 1900s. After the death of Charles on the 13th of February 1911, and obviously when Alice herself had been seen to and then released from hospital, life changed for the Laffan family, and it had serious consequences because the family itself became divided. 3, if not 4 of the children themselves went to live with their uncle and auntie on Padiham Road. One of them, Charlie, he, from all accounts and from the records we found, would enter a workhouse. As for his 3 other brothers and sisters who were at their aunts and uncles on Paddy Road, they all became weavers. They all ended up working in a cotton mill. They become weavers. Now Charlie himself, upon leaving the actual workhouse, the infirmary, he went from strength to strength. And from what we did find, and we found one census record, and on that record it actually said he was also a cotton weaver for a short time. He would end up becoming a police constable, and he made a successful, from what we believe, a successful career out of that. 3056, right. Yeah, I was just about to say to the viewers, I can actually see him being where all these trees are. What's behind there? I've got... No, it's not that one. That's Elsie and Ernest. So we're looking round here for Charles Laffan. I'm hoping I'm saying his name right, Laffan or Laffan. What are these here, Vic? So we can see the headstone names on this side.
See, that's
3089. I've got a feeling it's here.
We've been here. 3056.
Yeah, but 3056. Then it's 30, obviously 55, 54, 53, 52. You know what I mean? So it's going to be somewhere. Yeah. So as we assumed, this area here where these trees are, you've got the headstone 3056, and we've just worked our way down from the path, and it continues sequentially in that direction. So if we come down from 64, 63, 62 all the way down to 56, 3056, you've got 3055, 3054, 3053, and then here, directly in front of this headstone, you are going to have somewhere here, we think, 3052. Because I'm just kind of going in line with the headstones. And this headstone here, a space, so here is where both Charles, the father, and his son, Charles James Laffan, both are currently interred. And again, as we thought may be the case, there's no headstone to verify that. But we have narrowed it all down from the 3000s down to just here. And it's a bit sad really, because you've got 2 interments here, father and son, and there's no headstone to remember their lives, to say that anybody is here. But there is headstones also missing across. I'm just here, but
there is quite a lot when you look at Burnley Cemetery though, isn't there?
Yeah, Burnley Cemetery, as Vicky's just saying off camera, it's old. There is a lot of interments, there's a lot of stories here, and we've covered quite a lot.
But if you turn around that, look at all that open space with no gravestones.
Yeah, I mean, again, even in that direction, there's countless plots, isn't there, with no headstones. And it's a shame, but I understand, you know, I mean, some families don't live anywhere near this area, so, you know, obviously they don't come down, they don't maintain it. I'm not saying this family in particular, because obviously there is no headstone, and some families may not even know the stories behind their history, the family history. It might be kept secret, and again, I'm not saying this is the case with this story. In fact, we know it's not the case with this story, because the lady in question contacted us and basically gave us the idea to do this story, and we asked her if we could do it, and she politely said no problem, go for it.
How do you know the headstone's not just been taken away because it's dangerous? You just
This is it. I mean, headstones, again, as Vicky's saying, I'm not sure if it's picking up, the camera's picking her voice up, but a lot of headstones are removed for safety reasons. It's not the fact that they've just gone and gone. They've literally had to be removed for safety reasons. And the further down you go into Burnley Cemetery, you will see a lot more headstones with wooden stakes leaning on them. But this for sure, this is, we believe, is where Charles and his son Charles are both interred here. And like I said, Charles Lafan himself was buried on the 18th of February 1911 under a small canopy of trees, as you see above us, and with very little people in attendance. And it is just here where he now lies with his son. So what do we actually know about Charles James Lafan? Very little is the honest truth. We spent all week, myself and Vicky, delving into this story. We've searched online archives, the British newspaper archive, Ancestry, and we found census records, we found newspaper articles on this tragic story. But very little is mentioned about his life and, in a way, what kind of character he was. All we know is from the actual inquest into the attack and the death of Charles on the 13th of February, and from his own father, Charles Sr. And Charles Sr., he was asked at the inquest, which took place at Cog Lane Police Station, if Charles, his son, was a drunkard. Now, Charles Sr., he was infuriated by this question. He didn't want his son's name tarred or blackened by being known as a drunkard, and this is what led to the attack on his wife Alice. Charles would defend his son, and although it was a tragic outcome, obviously he attacked a defenceless innocent person, he also took his own life, he would also still defend his son's reputation, and he would say that he was a hard worker. Every time he came home from the mill he worked at, he would always put his weekly wages down onto the table, and his mother would give him a shilling or two back out of his wage just so he's got some money for himself, but not enough to take it to the pubs, to the public houses, and to be drunk all the time. He didn't fritter away his money on drink. Now, the coroner, Mr. Robinson, he had no choice then but to basically tell the small jury, or ask the small jury, to deliver a verdict of Felo-de-se. Like I said, the terminology involves that of attacking another person and then taking that one's own life. There was nothing said about being of unsound mind. Again, unsound mind is a lot that you will hear and read in stories such as this, but in this case, that was never actually spoken of. It's just a tragic tale, and it's one which I don't think even the family members will ever get to the bottom of. Something happened at Scott's Terrace. Some words were said, voices were raised, and Charles snapped. He picked up that little axe, that handheld axe, and he took several blows towards Alice's head. Obviously, he intended to kill her, but that was extreme. Now, his father, Charles Sr., also said at the inquest that his son, from the Friday, the Saturday and the Sunday leading up to the attack on the Monday, was in a quiet, depressed kind of mood. He hardly spoke to anybody. But on the day of the attack, he never saw his son at all. The last time he saw him was on a Sunday evening. We know Charles Lafan went to work at the mill on the Monday morning, but then he told his bosses, his supervisor, that he was feeling unwell and that could he be dismissed from work for the day, which they did. Now obviously we know what happened then. Charles went to the home of Alice where he attacked her. But other than that, his father said he just seemed in a very quiet stupor for that weekend. Obviously, advancements in profiling. Some would argue he'd had these thoughts of maybe attacking Alice. He had nothing to live for, his children weren't with him anymore. You know, perhaps he was going through a state of depression. We'll just never know. But it is a tragic event, and one that I don't think any of us can fully comprehend unless we've gone through it. But give us your thoughts down below and tell us what you think of this tragic tale. It's not the longest of stories that we've covered, but it's still another tragic one that took place here in the heart of Burnley. Tell us your thoughts down below. And just like the subscriber and the lady who kindly tipped us off about this story and the tragedy that has occurred in her family, if you've got any stories you think may be of interest to other viewers and you want us to try and look into it and to cover it for you, again, let us know down below, or contact us via our website at www.daysofhorror.com, and we will respond and we will look into it for you. But in the meantime, I just want to thank you all for coming along on this short journey with us. We hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to give us a big thumbs up, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to share this video and all the others that we've done, because it does help the channel grow and we do greatly appreciate it. But in the meantime, guys, I want to take care, look after yourselves, and we will be back soon with other tales from a dark, and I always say it, but at times glorious past. So take care, everybody.